Ah! Welcome to April the 12th. Breakfast was unbuttered brown toast with probably too much jam on top. Lunch was the last of the vegetable pasties with Ovaltine cake. And dinner was the last of the stew with mashed potato and leeks on top and baked in the oven. All, as usual, all washed down with tea. And now the events of the 12th of April 1945. In France, the Battle of Orthyon ends with an Allied victory. This meant one of the last pockets of German resistance on French soil had been squeezed out, and the country was virtually free of hostile Germans for the first time in 5 years. In Germany, Generals Patton, Eisenhower and Bradley visited a salt mine in the town of Murkers. Around the 2nd of April, some American units came across a salt mine being worked on by slave labourers. By the 4th, they'd cleared out the guards and released the slaves, who mentioned some German equipment and money, but not much else. Days later, the military police discovered tons of gold hidden in the mine, along with masses of stolen belongings. This was kept quiet until the story leaked out about a week later. At this point, the Allies went public about the discovery. Patton wrote in his diary, "In addition to the paper money and gold bricks, there was a great deal of French, American and British gold currency. Also a number of suitcases filled with jewellery, such as silver and gold cigarette cases, wristwatch cases, spoons, forks, vases, gold-filled teeth, false teeth, etc. Accounts differ on the amount and value of the treasure found. According to one account, there was 100 tons of gold, 27 Rembrandt paintings, and treasures from at least 15 museums. According to the Truman Library, the gold found was worth about $2 million. That's $32 million in today's money. Writer Greg Bradshaw seems to have the most complete list of what was found, and lists the total value of gold found in this mine and 3 other locations, added up to $262,213,000. In gold, $270,469 worth of silver and 1 ton of platinum. That's around $4.2 billion in today's money. Much of the stolen gold was turned over to the Tripartite Gold Commission, who set about returning it to the banks of the countries from whence it was stolen. However, the Cold War prevented a loss of that, and by the 1990s there was still 5.5 tons of gold unreturned. A conference was held in London in 1997, and 15 of the countries who hadn't received their gold back actually donated it to the Nazi Persecution Relief Fund. After Eisenhower, Bradley and Patton had seen the Murkers mine for themselves, they went to Ordruff concentration camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald. In Patton's words, "We visited the first horror camp any of us had ever seen. It was the most appalling sight imaginable. There the generals were shown the gallows where people were hung with piano wire, taking 15 minutes to die. They were shown the table where prisoners were stretched across it, held down by guards, and then beaten with a stick that was thicker than a pickaxe handle. They witnessed the bodies strewn everywhere, heaps of partially burnt bodies, other heaps of bodies covered in lime in an attempt to reduce the smell." Some accounts say that Patton threw up on seeing a hut full of rotting corpses. I can't blame him. Elsewhere in Germany, an advancing British column had just crossed the Aller River when they came across some German officers waving a white flag and holding their hands up. When approached, they said they weren't surrendering, but they had been sent as a warning about a camp 12 miles up ahead where typhus had broken out among the 60,000 prisoners. The German proposal was that a no-fire zone should be imposed around the camp so that the prisoners couldn't escape and the disease couldn't spread. The no-fire zone was agreed, but it would be a few days before the column got there. One of the officers in this British unit was Major Leonard Burney of the Royal Artillery, who'd celebrated his 25th birthday the day before. In 3 days' time, he'd be the first British officer to enter the now notorious Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Despite the horrors of concentration camps and the excitement of mines full of gold, the biggest news event of the 12th of April was still to come. General Patton went to bed that night and turned on the radio set to get an idea of the time as his watch had run down. It was then that he heard the news that US President Roosevelt had died at the age of 63. Patton informed Ike and Bradley, who then had a long discussion about the situation. He wrote in his diary, "It seemed very unfortunate to us that at this so critical period in our history we should have to change horses." Roosevelt had been president for 12 years and was the only US president to be elected 4 times. He had been sitting for a portrait around noon, and then the painting was paused while everyone had lunch. While eating, he suddenly complained of a massive headache and collapsed. His doctor diagnosed a major brain hemorrhage, and the president never regained consciousness. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead at 3:35 p.m. that day. The portrait remains unfinished and still hangs in the Little White House in Warm Springs. The news affected everyone around the world. Sergeant Trevor Greenwood, the tank commander lighting up dance halls in Holland, wrote in his diary, "A horrible blow. Learnt of the death of President Roosevelt. Terrible news." Many in Britain didn't find out until the following day, which happened to be Friday the 13th. Tributes poured in both to his family but also in people's diaries and memoirs. British Admiral of the Fleet Andrew Cunningham talked of the loss being a heavy blow. In his memoirs he wrote, "I cannot attempt to describe a world figure of immense stature, but we felt we had not only lost a wise ally, but a firm and wholehearted friend of Britain." He goes on for 1.5 pages about the admiration and affection everyone had for him, and the help he gave Britain when America was still neutral. One of the worst people affected by Roosevelt's death was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Never before or since has there been such a close relationship between an American president and a British Prime Minister, perhaps in part to the fact that Churchill himself was half American. Churchill wrote, "When I received these tidings early in the morning, I felt as if I had been struck a physical blow." He talks of a shining personality and a sense of deep and irreparable loss. Churchill proposed to the House of Commons that morning that they should adjourn immediately out of respect for the President, and it was a unanimous vote. Churchill had first met Roosevelt just after the end of the Great War, but only briefly. However, since September 1939, before he was even Prime Minister, Churchill had been in regular direct contact with Roosevelt on naval matters, and this regular correspondence, as well as several face-to-face meetings, had continued right up until a week before Roosevelt died. Churchill reckoned they'd contacted each other over 1,700 times. That's almost one a day for 5.5 years. They'd met in person 9 times and spent a total of 120 days together. For about 6 pages, Churchill pours out his heart about Roosevelt before quickly turning to a concern that his replacement seems to know very little about what's going on. Just over 3 hours after Roosevelt's death, Harry S. Truman was sworn in as president at just after 7 in the evening. Truman and Churchill would not work together long enough to develop anything like the special relationship that had existed previously. In Moscow, black-bordered flags were flown, and when the Supreme Soviet met, they stood in silence. Stalin wrote to Churchill talking of how Roosevelt had always shown Russia kindness, and on a personal level he said, "I feel exceptionally deeply the burden of the loss of this great man, who was our mutual friend." In Berlin, the news held a very different meaning. One of the themes running through Nazi thinking was that of prophecy, fate, and history repeating itself. The very fact they called their empire the Third Reich was harking back to the idea of the previous German empires. The Holy Roman Empire can be considered the First Reich, led by the likes of Charlemagne or Charles the Great in the 9th century or Otto the Great in the 10th century. The Second Reich was formed after the Franco-Prussian War with the crowning of Wilhelm I as Emperor and Otto von Bismarck as Chancellor. Since the collapse of the Second Reich in 1919, Hitler had sought to rebuild the German Empire and always had such figures in his mind. One in particular seems to have stuck, which is Frederick the Great. There were a lot of so-called greats. Every time Hitler moved his headquarters, he took Anton Graf's portrait of Frederick with him. Writer Robin Cross tells us, as darkness closed around the Third Reich, Hitler spent an increasing amount of time closeted with the Graf portrait, in silent communion with the man he claimed as his military mentor. Frederick II, as he was officially known, had been King of Prussia in the 18th century, and is widely regarded as a military genius. He knew how to handle limited resources, understood the strategy of survival, and was a firm believer that wars were won by battles. During the 7 Years' War, Prussia and Russia were locked in combat, and by January 1762, the Russian army was banging on the gates of Berlin. On the 5th of January, just as Frederick was beginning to lose hope, the Russian Empress Elizabeth died. She was replaced by her nephew, Peter III, who was an admirer of Frederick. He immediately called a halt to the Russian advance with an armistice in March and a peace treaty being signed in May. This is often referred to as the Second Miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Back in the bunker in Berlin in 1945, with the Russians banging on the gates, you can imagine the effect on the Axis High Command when they hear that Roosevelt has suddenly died. Goebbels rang Hitler and said, "My Führer, I congratulate you. It is written in the stars that the second half of April will be the turning point for us." Many, including Hitler, now hoped that the Americans and Russians would start fighting each other and that Berlin would be saved once again. As we shall see, that wasn't the case. Thank you for watching today's episode of the Reich and Rations project. If you enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. If you would like to see regular updates of what our rationing challenge entails, you can find out more by searching #VictoryRationsProject or following @TimeForHomeLife on Instagram. Good night.